Grandmaster Davorin Kuljasevic, and I'm happy to present my dynamic anti-Catalan repertoire for black. I created this repertoire primarily for players who would like to get dynamic positions against one of the most solid closed openings, the Catalan. And we will see that even though it's not always possible to get the dynamic position that you want, it is possible to maximize such options and to make it more difficult for white to obtain advantage in the opening by strictly positional means. Because we know that Catalan players like to do the Catalan grind, where they have the slight positional edge that they can sometimes nurture into the endgame. And this can become quite a tedious job to play these kinds of positions with black. So the goal is to set the tempo right from the start with black, to force white to enter some sharp and principled lines if he wants to obtain advantage from the opening. The second goal that I had was to look at all the different move orders that white can throw at you, trying to get their favorite Catalan positions. So besides this move order that we see on the board with d4 and c4 already played, white can also omit the move d4 or the move c4, start with early g3, and so on. So we'll look at all of these important move orders. But for start, let's look at my main recommendation in the main line, which starts usually with these three moves. Okay, sometimes white plays knight f3 instead of g3, but it typically transposes. So of course we played d5, and here black has a wide choice. Bishop e7 and bishop b4 on the highest level are the main moves, but since our goal is to dynamize the game as early as possible, I think that taking on c4 is the most natural choice. And we are basically asking white, how is he gonna recoup this pawn, or if he's gonna do it at all. And here it's possible to do it at once with queen a4, but the most common move is knight f3, so we'll first focus on this main line. And again, here black has a really rich choice of options. Knight c6 followed by rook b8 and b5, or a6 with a similar idea to push b5 are quite common. There is bishop b4 check. For my previous anti-Catalan repertoire for modern chess, I looked at the move bishop d7, which is a very interesting option as well. But here I will recommend a variation that's quite rare, and it's the move c6. The idea is similar to a6 variations, just to support b5, to protect the pawn on c4. And this variation has become very popular over the last, I think, 2 years, although previously in the past I don't think it was kind of overlooked. And when researching this variation, I found an old game by Paul Keres from 1947, where he played c6, and he played it quite successfully against a strong player, Igor Bondarevsky. And we will actually see this move or see this game later. And for a very long time it hasn't been really studied too much or played, but then maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, with efforts of some strong players, it has been revived, and I think it can lead to the dynamic kind of play that we are after. So here white has basically three main options. The most principled one is knight e5, trying to get the pawn back immediately and stopping b5. There is also castling, which is the move where basically white gambits this pawn, maybe doesn't even want to take it back, but just uses his lead in development. So when we played the move b5, very often white's approach is to play b3 and to just speed up the development, open some files against on the queen side against this weak pawn on c6 and a6 or a7. So that's a legitimate approach for white, and we will study this one in chapter 9. Then in chapter 10 we will look at the positional approach with a4, where b5 is stopped, but on the other hand the downside of this move is that it weakens the b4 square. So like I said, maybe white avoids critical lines and wants to play more positionally, but there are some downsides to this approach as well, and black typically gets a comfortable game after a5, b6 and so on. But let us just spend a little bit more time on knight e5. This is indeed the principal move, and the critical one. It's covered in chapter 8. Here we give a check, and the point was that with the move knight e5 the d4 pawn has been weakened, so you cannot play a move like knight e2 for example. But bishop d2, which is a sharp move allowing queen takes d4, it is the main line, and I suggest here that we do not take the pawn. It leads to some very risky positions for black, but instead to retreat, bishop e7. Now d4 is hanging anyway, and probably the best way for white to defend this pawn is e3, although there are some alternatives, but this is the critical move. And here it seems like white is getting what he wants, right? He's taking back on c4 and tries to do the typical Catalan grind, but the move b5 is basically the idea here for black. It's essentially an exchange sacrifice. We cannot avoid this, but we actually are looking forward to this kind of position because we get full compensation for the exchange. White sooner or later has to play f3, and then we have the move e5, where we are opening up our light square bishop. If he takes, we have knight g4 followed by knight takes e5 and knight d3. And I think it's easy to see here how black obtains good compensation. It is even possible to play this kind of position for a win, because white king is weak. There are some positional weaknesses in white position. So I think a pretty good choice in this kind of a repertoire. Now the other option for white I just have to mention is knight c3. It's also going to be covered in chapter 8. And then we go knight d5. And again, white can complicate matters, try to be principled, castle, sacrifice the second pawn, leads to very interesting play. The more solid move is bishop d2, which was also played by Bondarevsky against Keres in the game we mentioned. And here black also has a choice. He can play b5, a dynamic option, trying to hold on to the pawn and create his chances on the queen side. Very playable. And knight b6 is a more solid option. Now what Bondarevsky played here is also the main line these days, knight e4, and a5. This is an important move. We don't mind him taking on b4 because opening of the a file is in our favor. And let's just quickly go through a couple of moves from this game. So white is taking back his pawn on c4, but in return black opens the a file for counterplay and now is threatening to go e5. Bondarevsky played f4 to stop it, but this has weakened his e3 pawn, and now Keres carried out the c5 break and fully equalized here. So it's just an example to see what kind of positions we're aiming for in the Keres variation. And like I said, I believe it's a really interesting and fairly rare option against the main line of the Catalan. Now, it is also possible for white to play queen a4, like I mentioned, to recoup the pawn at once. Here I recommend knight d7, followed by c5 here, and then, if possible, a6 and b5. This is covered in chapter 7. So this is, let's say, a tabia of this variation. And it's, of course, I looked at many other branches, but we could say that this is the most popular position that arises here. What else is there? We have to look at different move orders. So let's come back all the way to the start. Instead of playing d4, if your opponent sees that you play the Keres variation, where you take on c4 and play c6, they can try to trick you with move orders, like starting with knight f3 and omitting the move d4, right? Now if you take on c4, this leads to different types of positions. You're not in the Keres variation anymore. It is a legitimate approach. It's also possible to play bishop e7, but then d4 I think transposes into the main line of the Catalan. But looking for more dynamic types of positions, I stopped at d4. I think this is a very interesting approach. It's been considered kind of not principled previously, because typically you get some sort of reverse Benoni, but with being down a tempo or two. But actually, this doesn't matter too much. With precise play, black gets very interesting positions here, and not worse. So this is the important moment. Like I said, Benoni, reverse Benoni, and some of the strategic rules apply here as well. We have to choose how to develop here, because we want to push e5 typically. And there are three moves in this position: bishop e7, h6 to stop bishop g5, and bishop d6. My preference here is bishop d6, which is allowing white to play bishop g5. I mean, to take on f6, and then queen has to take back, which is not so convenient. But the main idea is to control the e5 square, and I think that is the best move in the position. Now, in chapter 1, we will look at knight a3. This is a very important move here. White goes for knight c2 and b4 very quickly, and typically we get sharp play as black plays e5 and tries to create play in the center. Black tries to do the same on the queen side. In chapter 2, instead of knight a3, we'll look at bishop g5, probably the main and the critical line. Like I said, some strategic rules apply from the normal Benoni. For example, exchanging this bishop is typically good, because you also get better control as white of the e4 square. So after that, the knight goes to d2 and e4. White tries to push c5 and so on. Again, leads to very interesting positions. This will be covered in chapter 2. Just as a quick note, you also are covered in case that white plays c4 on move 1 with g3, because then you can just play d5, and it's pretty much transposing. He'll have to play knight f3. If he plays a move like b3, you can also play d4. So it's just transposing into these first two chapters. Now, in case that white tries to trick you with move orders that are, so starts with d4 but not c4 on move 2. So we can start with knight f3, and then if you play e6, g3. And this way, again, if you play d5, bishop g2, you don't have d takes c4 now, right? So you cannot transpose into Keres variation, and you have to do something else in this position. But my suggestion is, anyway, in this position, to play more dynamically, and even to take advantage of the fact that white has not played c4, and to play b5. So it's an extended fianchetto. It's like the Queen's Indian defense, but not possible for white to play c4. And here white has many options, really. Most of them, like moves like bishop g5, a4, queen d3, knight bd2, e3. These will be covered in chapter 3. The main line is bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, c5. So I prefer to play this position with c5. Some players prefer to play d5 instead of c5, but I will explain why I don't think that's such a dynamic option, at least. But this leads to interesting positions also. They're quite flexible for both sides. So this will be covered in chapter 4. In chapter 5, I will cover actually an interesting move order for white, and this is if he starts with g3, because now you can see that b5 is not really that good. You can play b5, but after bishop g2 you cannot play bishop b7, so you have to play some move that you don't want. And it's a rare move order, but you know, it can create a hole in your opening repertoire if you're not sure what to do, if b5 is not an option. So here I suggest that you start with d5. Anyway, if you play d5 instead of e6 with knight f3 move order, you can get a very similar position. So here the thing is that white has showed his cards with g3, so you don't have to play e6. You know that he's already going for Catalan positions, and actually, why not use the option of bishop f5 to develop the bishop to a good diagonal. This leads to positions that are not that are more like Slav defense types of positions, but very solid for black, and I think very easy to learn as well. What is important in these positions is that we play, as soon as white plays knight c3, typically to play h6, to prevent knight h4 option, where white is claiming the bishop pair advantage. So we secure the retreat for the bishop. And like I said, this looks like the Slav defense. And here I prefer the move bishop e7 over knight bd7 slightly, so I will focus on this move. The main approach for white is queen b3, and this will be covered in chapter 6. In chapter 5, we will look at the sidelines with knight d2, preparing e4, b3, preparing bishop b2, and just a solid double fianchetto position. But in chapter 6, this is probably the critical line, where white pushes c5 and tries to open the a file for pressure in the endgame. And we have two options. The more dynamic one is queen a6, preparing b6 break. And the other one is queen b3, a takes b3. And this endgame is very solid for black. Maybe not such a dynamic, but more like a solid option. And we will see in chapter 6 that we don't have to be afraid of the b4, b5 break. In fact, if white does it, he might get in trouble if he does it too early. So I think that's all in terms of the material that we're gonna look at in the database. So in the next 10 videos, we will focus on particular chapters, and I will show some important ideas, sometimes move orders, sometimes model games or critical lines that you should pay attention when looking at the material from the files. So I'll see you soon in the next video.